let's look at Leviticus chapter 40. Is that what we're looking at? Chapter 26, verse 40. No, that doesn't make sense. I am looking at Leviticus chapter 26, verse 40. And this is on page 546. Okay, you see it? Let's read. So this week's reading describes what happens when we follow God's statutes and the blessings that result, and then what happens when we reject God's statutes, when we turn away from God, and the consequences, the punishments that result. And there are some very strong words in this reading. If we just let's go back for strong words. Let's look to verse 36, page 545. And as for them that are left of you, I will send a faintness into their heart in the hands of their enemies. And the sound of a driven leaf shall chase them, and they shall flee as one flees from the sword. And they shall fall when none pursues. And they shall stumble one upon the other, as it were before the sword when none pursues, and you shall have no power to stand before your enemies. And you shall perish among the nations, and the land of your enemies shall eat you up. Verse 39, and they that are left of you shall pine away in their iniquity in your enemies' lands, and also in the iniquities of their fathers shall they pine away with them. So this is the kind of the bottom line, what happens to us when we've turned away from God and turned away from God's teachings.
Is that what happened in the Holocaust? So many of us...
Well, there we were being chased by the sword.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the anxiety of the Jew who no longer has confidence in what it is to be a Jew, and the fear of standing up for who one is losing one's identity, is the biggest curse of all that results in turning away from the Torah, is that we become anxious and insecure.
Is that why the Holocaust happened, though? Because some Jews did turn away.
I don't. Let's not talk about the Holocaust.
Okay.
Because
too much emotion.
Yeah, too much emotion. It's very hard to think when we talk about the Holocaust. You can't learn lessons from your problems while the problem is ongoing. And in many ways we're still in the throes of the post-Holocaust suffering. But nonetheless, I think that that the anxiety, and this is a modern problem that goes on today. I think the anxiety, the uncertainty, the feeling of insecurity is the final blow. And then verse 40. And after all, and by the way, the truth is, while I think that this is in a way the worst, from a, meaning if you take like a Maslow's hierarchy, right? When you attack the more basic needs, right? The bottom, the safety, etc. Those are maybe more brutal, but the higher on the Maslow's hierarchy, the higher functions, such as ultimately the actualization of self, removing that is, in a sense, the most insulting. In a way, it's the end of it all. Meaning, I don't mean to be insensitive to the loss of life or the loss of security, or the actual terrible things that are described, and the illness and the dispersion and all that. It's not in any way to understate the brutality and severity of that, but while they hurt, it's possible for a person to maintain a sense of self that is that transcends. So I'll give you a machlokes between two famous psychologists. On the one hand, you have Abraham Maslow, and on the other hand, you have Viktor Frankl, right? So Abraham Maslow says that there's a hierarchy of needs, that the first need that a person has is simply safety and security, and above that, a person has the need to have food and shelter, and then after that, a person has the need for love and relationships, and then finally connectedness, and then finally a person has the need to actualize themselves with creativity and with art and with spirituality, etc., right? Which suggests that if a person doesn't have security, it's impossible for them to be in a relationship, and if a person doesn't have healthy relationships, it's impossible for them to actualize themselves fully, right? On the other hand, you have Viktor Frankl, who talks about how despite being in the horrors of the Holocaust, okay, so we talked about the Holocaust. Despite being in the horrors of the Holocaust, he was able to find a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose that allowed him to maintain his sense of self and to survive, that there would be someone who survives the Holocaust. Yeah. So this, you hear the machlokes, you hear the dichotomy, right? There's this duality between this conflict between the Maslow's approach and the Viktor and the Frankl's approach. So it seems to me that there obviously, I mean, there's truth to both of them, and removing someone's basic needs is brutal. But at the same time, if you take away a person's ability to self-actualize, take away their sense of what their life is all about, in a way that's the most hopeless of all, right? It's and in a way that's the
base, possibly.
Yeah, in a way, it's in a way, I think that's the affliction of our time, where we have all the fundamental needs here, but without the final need, which is the need to know where you're going in life. All the other needs become unappreciated, and you can have a person who lives. Suicide is a rich person's, certainly, let's say in our society, right? Suicide is a rich person's illness, right? I know that that's not entirely true, but nonetheless, I'll say, I'll not characterize what suicide is, but there is a specific, there are rich people who have everything are still so messed up that they go and kill themselves, right? So that's to say that without that sense of self, without that sense of a healthy sense of self-actualization, all the comforts in the world are meaningless, to the point that life itself becomes meaningless. So I think that's it seems kind of like no one's chasing you anymore, but you're still running. Uh, there's no threat, but you still collapse at the sound of a driven leaf, or the sight of a driven leaf. So with that sense of without that when the identity is ruined, so then you don't need anything to chase you anymore. Anyway, so that's point number 1. Then verse 40, and now we have the turning point. And they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers, and also that they have walked contrary unto me. Here's the idea of confession. So the rabbis discuss, what is the idea of this confession? Verse 41, I will also walk contrary unto them, and bring them into the land of their enemies. Oh, if then perchance their uncircumcised heart be humbled, and they then be paid the punishment of their iniquity.
How do they pay the punishment? How do I pay the punishment?
God pays the punishment of their iniquity.
Oh, God pays.
Yeah. This is God saying, I will walk with them. Meaning the same way that they rejected me, right? If you look at the end of verse 40, that they will confess their sin and their sin of their ancestors in that which they have committed against me, treachery, and that they have walked contrary against me. And then I too will walk contrary against them, and will bring them into the land of their enemies. Oh, maybe then will their hearts be humbled, and their sin be paid. And so finally we can... Okay. So what's interesting here is that confession comes, and then there's still a little more punishment. And then finally, I will remember the covenant with Jacob and the covenant with Isaac and the covenant with Abraham. And I will remember the land. For the land will be forsaken without them, and shall be paid for her Sabbaths, why she lie desolate without them, and they shall be paid the punishment of their iniquity, because they rejected my ordinances and their whole soul abhorred my statutes. And yet for all that, when they are in the land of my enemies, I will not reject them, nor will I abhor them, to destroy them utterly, to break my covenant with them, for I am the Lord their God, but I will for their sakes remember the covenant of their ancestors. And that's the end, right? And it ends off on a good note there. Right? I'll remember the covenant, and don't give up hope. We will survive. So what's interesting here, the confession. What's the value of the confession? And why is it that we have to return to the punishment even after the confession? Isn't the confession alone a sign of our return, that we're turning a new leaf? And so the Rabbi explains that there are really two, based on the teachings of earlier rabbis, that you might say that there are two ways in which a person returns from sin, in which a person recovers from sin. One is by returning to God. And the other is, which is alluded to in this week's reading, through suffering. But I wondered, what is the point of suffering if not to bring us to return to God? So in a sense, the confession might be a reflection of the fact that so the Rebbe explains essentially that a person could return to God. When a person returns to God only from suffering, there is a certain coercion to it. Meaning, a person might say, and which you might say there are a number of levels to this. A person, on the one hand, might say, I realized that my lifestyle was not worth it because it resulted in suffering. So if I realized that my lifestyle was not worth it, that's not necessarily a rejection of the lifestyle itself. It's not necessarily acknowledging that I sinned. It's just saying, that didn't go anywhere, right? It's not necessarily a return to God. A person also might confess their sins when they suffer and kind of find themselves led to a new lifestyle through their suffering, punished and therefore behaving. But here, this too, not necessarily has the person truly embraced their a new way of thinking. The best and highest example of the way a person can do teshuvah, where a person returns to God, is where they do so through epiphany, through embracing from the inside an awareness, a higher awareness. And this is best done of a person's free will and not out of suffering. Right? Which is why, even after confessing our sins, if it comes as a result of suffering, there is still some follow-up needed. And that is to remember the covenant with our ancestors. And then to recognize that God hasn't lost hope in us. Right? So what happens is a person is brought to the brink through suffering and then kind of is and no longer has the freedom to sin, right? Realizes that the sin wasn't worth it, but still hasn't achieved enlightenment. They just don't have the time, the money to sin, or it loses its taste. The sin has lost its taste, but they haven't necessarily subscribed to a better life in a real way. Whereas when we, and therefore after this, there is still, I will go with them contrary and bring them to the land of their enemies. What's really required is that their heart become humbled, and only then shall their sin be, how does he translate it? Will their sin be paid, or will their punishment of their iniquity be paid? But even still, it's not enough, because if the heart is humbled, and that's how we come to God, having been humbled, it's still not enough, and it's still required an additional source of inspiration, which is God remembering his covenant. And after all of that, the last thing that's still the last saving grace is that God says, even though they're in the land of their enemies, I haven't rejected them completely, because I am the Lord their God. And so the recognition that God loves us and cares for us no matter what, even when we are suffering, even when we're in the land of our enemies, even when we have assimilated, that itself is maybe the last step. which meaning what suffering can't do, what punishment can't accomplish fully, a realization of God's love can. Now, again, the suffering is a path, is part of the path, but the path has to result in arriving to the awareness of God's love. So we might have to reject certain foolish things, right? It's kind of like, you know what I mean? A person goes to a cemetery and becomes aware of the fleeting nature of life. That's part of the reason that we go to pray in a cemetery, is because it helps us to let go of the foolish things, right? Helps us to organize our priorities properly. But that's not necessarily enlightenment. That's just a rejection of folly. What we need to do is embrace. We need to embrace what's important in life and not just lose interest in that which isn't important. And so this is the real change, the real inner change is possible when we're free. So going back to Maszlow and Frankl, it's possible for a person to hold on to their transcendent ideals. Not only that, it's possible for the suffering itself to bring a person to an awareness of the transcendent ideals. But the most fulsome way in which a person really transforms is in Maslow's version, where a person has everything, and in the freedom of comfort chooses enlightenment and chooses meaning. Not where we're, so to put it in practical terms for Jews, not where we're Jews despite the fact that the Nazis or the anti-Semites are persecuting us, and not where we discover a greater commitment to Judaism through anti-Semitism, but that in the freedom and in the comfort, we embrace, explore, and celebrate what it is to be a Jew. And that, I think, is not a reactionary type of faith. It's the most deepest and inner transformation, the one that'll be the most complete, is the one that happens in the modern world. And I think it's also interesting, going back to the running away when no one's chasing you, right? This is meaning it's saying that there'll be a time of prosperity, and yet we've lost our anchor, we've lost our compass, we don't know who we are, where we are, right? And so in that time of prosperity and in that time of comfort, when we discover who we are and where we are, that's the most meaningful and deepest way.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So when Mashiach comes, it wouldn't be out of suffering. That's what we talk about Mashiach, being a time of plenty. It wouldn't that kind of transformation, the kind of transformation that's required in order to bring a new world order, it requires that each individual embrace their identity. Shared trauma has a way of identity through trauma is unifying, right?
9/11.
Yeah, remember America after 9/11? It was geschmack. I mean, everyone was so together. Everyone was so, you really felt it. So shared trauma has a way of unifying us. And shared comfort has a way of dividing us. When we're all comfortable and we all have everything that we want, we tend to bicker a lot more. So this is the challenge of being in the time of comfort. The reason is because the trauma overrides our sense of self. And what we need is to be able to discover our true sense of self and to really not override, but to really transform who we are. Meaning to get it. We have to get it and not follow it. We have to have buy-in. A new world order in which there's real prosperity for everyone and real world peace and true enlightenment and people really working together requires that every person buy in to enlightenment. Right? Not that we follow a benevolent dictator, but that we all as individuals buy in. And if God loves us and cares about us, then really and hopes for us, what God hopes is not that we'll one day follow, but that we'll one day buy in, that we'll get it. Okay.